Welcome to part 2 of What is Politics? Power and Citizenship in American Politics. We want to discuss the 3 definitions of politics in this section. The first definition is politics is a way of determining without recourse to violence who gets the power and resources in society and how they get them. The second is that politics is a process or an activity through which power and resources are gained and lost. Basically, who gets what, when, and how. The third one we'll talk about in a minute, but first let's break down these wordy definitions into something which is going to help us understand. Mostly, we think politics is equal to government. However, we want to dispel that myth immediately. Politics and government are not the same thing. Government is actually a system or an organization for exercising legitimate power. Legitimate power just means that the power is proper or right, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. Politics, on the other hand, is a process or an activity through which power and resources are gained or lost. Politics grants legitimate power to a government to exercise. For example, we have the political process, and that gives power to a government. When political process gives power to the government, then that government is seen as a legitimate power. It's seen as having what we call authority. Right now, our political process is giving power to the United States of America government, and so we recognize that government as having legitimate power, or having that authority which we see. However, the political process could give power to another party. It could, for example, give power to the United States of Tamina Alan with its own little purple flag. And it could recognize another government or another system that as its own government, another organization, as something which it's going to give power to. However, since there is no power which is given to this particular entity, then that government in and of itself has no authority and has no legitimate power. Let's talk about this a little more. So, government is a system or organization for exercising the power which is given to it by the political process. Politics, on the other hand, is that process or activity which is going to allocate the power. It decides how power is gained or lost. And so, a legitimate government which is exercising the power wouldn't be able to operate without the political process to give them power in the first place. And so, without the political process, there is no government, or there's no system or organization. However, there could be a political process which chooses different systems or organizations which don't look anything like the ones that we're aware of, and that would create a legitimate system, even though it's not the government that we generally think of as a government. So politics gives power to the governments to exercise, and it can take it away at any point if it decides it's a government that it no longer likes. It can set up a different government, it can set up a different system, it can set up a different organization by allocating power in whichever way that it chooses. So let's talk a little bit about the role of power of itself. We already talked about politics as being a process or an activity through which this power is gained or lost. So what is power? Power is the ability to do. It's the ability to control or command others, and essentially to get what you want or to control who gets what you want. Therefore, when we're thinking about politics as a process or an activity through which power is gained or lost, we're really thinking of it as a process or an activity through which decides who actually gets. Who gets the power? Who gets what? Who is it that gets? When they get it? And how they get it. Now, before this completely confuses you, I want you to, and this is why I said that we might want to erase a little bit about what we think of when we think of politics. I want you to think of this definition in and of itself. When you read this and you think of a process that determines who actually gets stuff, when they get it, when they get the stuff, how they get the stuff, and what stuff they're actually getting, we don't necessarily think of Washington, D.C. Or we can, but that's not what I want to think about right now. I want to introduce you to the concept of Mama's house. Mama's house is definitely what you could consider to be a government. It has a system or organization which is going to exercise power. And if you think about it, when you're at Mama's house, there is a process for deciding who gets. And it's usually mama's process. And it usually works some way like, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. But that's what's going to decide who gets what, when they get it, and how they get it. And that, in and of itself, is the political process happening. Because it's power being allocated in some way. In this sense, it's power being allocated by mama to whoever is making mama happy. And that is a political system in and of itself, without thinking of Washington, without thinking of many of the things that we might have brought into this idea of politics and power. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of legitimate power or authority. When we have a problem that we already talked about, politics giving power to a government and that causing the government to actually exercise what's called legitimate power, to have this authority. But sometimes we have a situation where there's no agreement on what is legitimate. There's no agreement on who the political process should be giving power to, which government, which system, or which organization should get it, and how they should exercise it. When that happens, and we don't have a legitimate government, then what often takes its place is violence. What happens here is that the political process isn't able to work itself out properly. It's not able to allocate power to one specific government in one way or another, and so the power kind of goes awry. Either the government itself that was established doesn't have power, or it's trying to give power to too many different places. And in this instance, we have a situation where we get violence. In this country, we've experienced this in quite a number of ways, but most famously in the way of the Civil War that we've had in this country. We had a political process which could not allocate the power only to one entity. Sometimes the power that was being allocated to the Union Party, but we had a problem in that it wasn't seen as legitimate power. It wasn't seen as the authority of everybody. The Confederate Party believed this to be something which wasn't legitimate, and because we did not have agreement on this, we had a severe time of violence in this country in our Civil War. And of course you can see this in different instances, not only across the many countries which you've probably studied or possibly lived, but also in the way that we can look at different areas of our lives and look at the way that power is allocated and what happens when the power is allocated and we don't agree with the way that that power is allocated. Oftentimes we get some sort of violent clash, which is not going to fit in with the way that we believe that the proper system should function. So we have politics to give us some sort of alternative to violence. Why do we have this? Basically, the main reason that we have this is because power and resources are scarce. We have a situation where not everybody can get everything that they want. If we had a situation where everyone could get everything that they want, we wouldn't need politics at all because we wouldn't have to divide up power and resources. We could say everyone has as much power and everyone has as much resources as they need, and so therefore there's no reason to allocate. But because we don't have an infinite amount of politics and resources, we have to find a way to allocate it that's not going to be this crazy, violent, free-for-all mess. We could have a system where everybody just fights over what they want, like putting 6 toddlers in a room and giving them 4 cookies. How are they going to allocate those? Well, if you have very mature 6-year-olds, then they might be able to divide up those cookies, but most likely what's going to happen is the biggest, strongest kid is going to take all of the cookies, try to ward everybody else off, or there's going to be some fighting and some argument over how these resources are going to be allocated. So given that we don't want violence, we actually choose to act politically. It's something we opt into. We choose to cooperate or bargain with other people, and this can be in our daily lives. We choose to compromise, to maybe split the cookies up for the kids who are around. We choose to enter into agreements or contracts. You choose to rent from your landlord, and you work together on how to allocate that particular resource. And then, of course, at higher levels, we deal with alliances and treaties, we vote, we have laws, and we agree that we want to do these things so that it's just not a matter of who's going to emerge as the Leviathan of the group. So remember, when we're dealing with politics, it's just a process or activity for allocating power, and it can mean any one of these things and many, many more. As long as it's something which is going to decide how power, how resources are gained or lost, then we have a political process. Now, I want to return our attention to the third definition of politics, which we put aside for a little bit. The third definition of politics is, again, it's a process, but it's a process through which we try to arrange our collective lives into some sort of social order. It's not only who gets what, when, how, and where, but we study people as a population together, and we look at the whole range of society to determine the social order which we're going to follow. We do this for a couple of reasons. First, because we don't live alone. We're bound to interact with other people. Unless you're a hermit living in a cave, you're going to see some other folks around. And we're going to have to figure out a way to exist with them and work with them and live with them in society. If you have a family, you have to figure out in that system how you're going to arrange yourselves in an order which you can interact with each other. Hopefully without crashing into each other and creating systems which aren't legitimate, where you have violence or you have disagreement. We also do this because we need the goods and services from others which we can't get for ourselves. Just think of our modern society, and if you're not a farmer, how you're going to get the food which you're going to eat at your table. You may have to barter, you may have to go to the grocery store and buy a head of kale, but you're going to need to get something from other people, and that requires you to exist in a society, in some sort of social order, in order to get the things that you want. And because you're going to have to do that, there's some sort of social contract which is going to have to exist to determine how you're going to act around other people. Also, we do this because we want to maximize our values and behaviors, and we do that by trying to influence the way that other people think. Especially if we're really attached to some particular idea or some particular notion, we want to influence other people to think like us so that we're able to actually exist in a way that we want to exist without other people coming in and believing that that particular way of acting is not something which is legitimate or good. The more people that we can have agree with us, the more that we can act in the way that we want to, the way that we choose, without getting stepping on anyone else's toes or getting into any arguments about that. So we also use this process to arrange our lives to help maximize our values and behaviors and kind of rub that off on others. You can think about that in the way that you interact with your family and the way that you interact with your friends. You can also think about that in the way that, for example, our country would interact with other countries and societies. And this tendency that we have to try to make others, other countries, other nations, other clubs, other people, in the instance of a parent, maybe other children or children of your own, how to make them more like you and how to make them think the way that you think.